Rome, 2024. A cardinal sits at a desk in a building near the Vatican. On the desk in front of him is a file. Inside the file is a report about a theologian, a priest, a professor, a man who has spent decades thinking carefully about God, whose ideas have been flagged as inconsistent with church teaching. The cardinal has the authority to investigate, to question, to censure, to instruct this theologian that he may no longer teach in Catholic institutions. The office the cardinal sits in has a name: the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. It was founded in 1542. It has never closed. Pull back 800 years. A different room. A different man. A different file.
A Dominican friar in southern France is sitting across a table from a farmer who has been accused of holding beliefs the church considers dangerous. The friar has a manual, a book of procedures, questions, legal standards. He will question the farmer carefully. He will write down the answers. If the farmer confesses and recants, he will be given a penance. If he does not recant, if he holds to his beliefs, whatever they are, however sincerely, he will be handed to the civil authorities. The friar believes he is trying to save the farmer's soul. The farmer may not experience it that way. This is how it began. Not with a bonfire, not with a dungeon, with a desk, with a file, with a man who believed he had both the right and the duty to decide what another man was allowed to think.
And what grew from that desk? Over 600 years, across 4 continents, through 4 distinct institutions, is what we are going to look at today. This is not a story about medieval monsters. This is not a story that ended with the Enlightenment. This is not a story about someone else's history. This is the story of the Inquisition. Not one Inquisition, but 4. The medieval, the Spanish, the Roman, and the Portuguese. Each with its own targets, its own methods, its own geography of fear. Together spanning 650 years. From 1184, when a papal bull called Ad Abolendum first formalized the prosecution of heresy, to 1834, when the Spanish Inquisition was finally formally abolished, and in one form continuing to the present day. We are going to look at all of it.
The massacres and the bureaucracy, the burning of a man who thought about stars, the inquisitor who stopped a witch panic, the San Benito robes that hung in churches for 2 centuries, marking the descendants of the condemned with their ancestors' shame. The numbers, real and mythologized, and why the difference matters. And the office in Rome that opened in 1542 and is still open today. Stay with me. Before we begin, one thing needs to be said plainly. There was not one Inquisition. This matters because when most people hear the word, when they picture the scene, they picture something singular, one institution, one place, one set of black-robed figures asking one kind of question of one kind of person in one century. The reality is 4 institutions operating across different centuries, in different countries, targeting different people for different reasons, with different levels of violence. The medieval Inquisition hunted Cathars and Waldensians in southern France and northern Italy. It was run by Dominican friars on behalf of the papacy. It killed hundreds over roughly a century and a half. The Spanish Inquisition hunted conversos, Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity, suspected of secret continued practice, along with Protestants, mystics, bigamists, and sodomites. It was run by the Spanish monarchy, not the Pope. It killed thousands over 350 years.
The Roman Inquisition hunted Protestants in Italy and scholars whose ideas threatened orthodoxy, including a friar who thought about stars and an astronomer who proved the earth moves around the sun. It was run directly by the papacy. It is still running. The Portuguese Inquisition hunted conversos in Portugal
and then extended across the Portuguese colonial empire, to Brazil, to Cape Verde, and to Goa on the western coast of India, where it ran for 250 years, and where most of the world has never heard of it. 4 institutions, 1 logic. Who has the right to decide what is true, and what power should that right carry? Everything that follows is an attempt to answer that question honestly. The document that started it all is not dramatic. Ad Abolandam.
Issued by Pope Lucius III in 1184 for the abolishing of heresy. 6 paragraphs of careful ecclesiastical Latin laying out a procedure. Bishops will conduct annual visitations to parishes suspected of harboring heretics. The accused will be questioned. Those who confess and recant will be given penances. Those who do not recant, or who relapse after recanting, will be handed to the secular authorities for punishment. The Church will not execute anyone. It will simply hand them over. This legal fiction, the Church washing its hands of the actual killing while constructing the entire machinery that made the killing possible, begins here in 1184 in 6 paragraphs of administrative Latin. It will be maintained for 600 years. It convinced no one then. It convinces no one now.
But it is important to understand what ad abolendum actually was, because it was not born from cruelty. It was born from a problem the medieval church genuinely faced and genuinely did not know how to solve. The problem was the Cathars. They had spread through southern France and northern Italy over the previous century, a religious movement that the church considered deeply heretical. The Cathars believed that the material world was created not by God, but by an evil principle. They rejected the sacraments. They rejected the authority of the Catholic clergy. They had their own clergy, the perfecti, the perfected ones, who lived lives of rigorous asceticism, ate no meat, owned nothing, and commanded enormous respect in the communities they served.
The ordinary Catholic Church, in the 12th century, commanded rather less respect. Its clergy were often corrupt, poorly educated, and visibly failing to live by the standards they preached. The Cathars, whatever their theology, looked more like what the Church claimed to be than the Church itself did. This was the problem. Argument had not worked. Preaching had not worked. A Spanish priest named Dominic de Guzman, later Saint Dominic, founder of the Dominican order, had spent years walking barefoot through southern France, eating what the local people ate, living simply, debating Cathar perfecti and public forums. He was brilliant. He was sincere. He was largely ignored. The Church needed a different approach. Ad abolendum was that approach: systematic, legal, bureaucratic.
The Dominican friars, Dominic's own order, built for exactly this purpose, would become the primary operators. They would travel. They would question. They would keep records. They would offer repentance and accept it when offered. They would hand the unrepentant to the civil authorities and go home and write up their notes. It was, on paper, more humane than what came before. What came before was this. 1209, 25 years after ad abolendum, Pope Innocent III has lost patience. The Cathar movement has not been argued or administered out of existence. It is thriving. The local nobility of southern France, the Counts of Toulouse, the Lords of the Languedoc, have been protecting it, in some cases sympathizing with it, in all cases refusing to suppress it by force.
Innocent III is one of the most powerful popes in the history of the Church. He is not accustomed to being ignored. He launches a crusade, not against Muslims in the Holy Land, against Christians in France. The Albigensian Crusade, named for the town of Albi, a center of Cathar presence, is the first crusade declared against a Christian population. It is military, it is brutal, and it begins with a massacre that has echoed down 8 centuries. Béziers, July 22nd, 1209. The crusading army arrives at the walled city of Béziers. The city is mixed, Cathar and Catholic, living alongside each other, as they had for generations in the Languedoc. The Crusaders face a practical problem. They cannot tell the heretics from the faithful.
They send a demand that the Catholics inside identify the Cathars and hand them over. The Catholics of Béziers refuse. They will not betray their neighbors. Whatever the theology, whatever the differences in belief, these are the people they have lived alongside, worked alongside, broken bread alongside. They refuse. The Crusaders turn to the papal legate. His name is Arnaud Amalric, the abbot of Citeaux, a Cistercian monk who has been given extraordinary authority over this crusade by Innocent III himself. They ask him, "How do we tell the heretics from the faithful?" The words attributed to him, recorded by a Cistercian monk named Caesarius of Heisterbach, writing some years later, are these: "Kill them all, God will know his own." Historians debate whether he said it.
Caesarius was not present. The account appears decades after the event. Arnaud Amalric himself, in a letter to Innocent III written shortly after the massacre, describes the slaughter with pride, but does not use that phrase. What is not debated is what happened next. The Crusaders entered Béziers. They killed. They did not stop to ask who believed what. In a single day, July 22, 1209, the feast day of Mary Magdalene, somewhere between 7,000 and 20,000 people died, Catholic and Cathar alike. Men, women, children. The Church of St. Mary Magdalene, where some had taken refuge, was burned with people inside it. 20,000 people, in a single day, in France, by an army that had left home carrying the cross.
Innocent III, when the reports reached him, expressed some disquiet about the scale of civilian casualties. He did not recall the crusade. It continued for 20 more years. The Albigensian Crusade eventually broke the back of the Cathar movement militarily, but it did not end Catharism. The perfecti went underground. The community survived, quietly, in villages and farms across the Languedoc. This is where the Inquisition, the actual institutional Inquisition, the friars with their files and their procedures, came in. And this is where we meet the most famous inquisitor in history. He was not what you expect. Bernard Guy, Dominican friar, Inquisitor of Toulouse from 1307 to 1323, 17 years, 930 cases.
Umberto Eco made him the villain of The Name of the Rose, cold, implacable, certain, enjoying his certainty. The real Bernard Guy was something more unsettling than a villain. He was a professional. He kept records of everything, every interrogation, every confession, every sentence, every appeal. His casebook survives. Historians can read it. Out of 930 cases over 17 years, 42 people were handed to the secular arm for execution. 42. The rest received penances, fasting, pilgrimage, the obligation to attend Mass on certain days, the wearing of yellow crosses sewn to their outer garments as public markers of their status as reconciled heretics. This was the medieval Inquisition at its most typical, not the bonfire, the yellow cross. The public humiliation, the surveillance, the requirement to present yourself periodically to your local church and confirm your continued orthodoxy, the knowledge that your neighbors knew, the knowledge that your children would grow up in the shadow of what you had confessed. Bernard Guy wrote a manual, the Practica Inquisitionis Hereticae Pravitates, the practical guide to the Inquisition of heretical wickedness. It is meticulous. It covers interrogation techniques, how to question a Cathar, how to question a Waldensian, how to recognize the evasions of the practiced heretic who has learned to answer questions without technically lying. It covers procedure. It covers sentencing guidelines. It is the work of a man who took his job seriously and believed with complete sincerity that what he was doing was necessary and good. He went home at night, he ate supper, he said his prayers, he got up in the morning and came back to his desk. This is what Hannah Arendt would later call the banality of evil, centuries before she named it. Not monsters, not sadists,
professionals. Men who believed in the system, served the system, improved the system, and went home at night without apparent difficulty. Bernard Guy died in 1331, peacefully in his bed, honored by his order and his church. The 42 people he sent to the secular arm did not die peacefully. By 1350, organized Catharism in southern France was effectively extinct.
The last known Cathar perfectus, a man named Guillaume Bellibaste, had been captured and burned in 1321, 2 years before Bernard Guy retired. The communities that had sheltered the perfecti had been documented, interrogated, penanced, and surveilled into silence. The medieval Inquisition had achieved its purpose. The machine it built, the procedures, the manuals, the legal structures, the trained operators, did not disappear with its purpose. It was waiting. And in 1478, in the court of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, someone decided to use it again. Let's stop here for a moment. We have covered the medieval Inquisition, the first one, the one that built the machine.
The papal bulls, the Dominican friars, the interrogation manuals, the yellow crosses sewn onto clothing, the 42 executions out of 930 cases in Toulouse over 17 years. And we have not yet touched the Spanish Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, the Portuguese Inquisition, the Goa Inquisition. The man burned alive in Rome in 1600 for thinking about stars. The children who inherited their parents' shame from cloth hung on a church wall. The inquisitor who read 1,800 witchcraft accusations and found nothing credible in any of them. We are one inquisition into 4. If you want to see where this goes, and where it ends, and whether it ends, stay with me. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is a good moment. This channel covers the full story of church history, the faith, the failures, the things that are still uncomfortable to say out loud. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. One more thing. Tell me in the comments, before you watched this, what did you think the Inquisition was? One institution, one century, one place? Or did you already know it was 4 separate machines running across 650 years? I want to know what you came in with. Comment below. All right, 1478, Spain. A Dominican friar named Tomás is about to walk into the court of a queen. He is her confessor, the priest she trusts with her sins, her fears, her conscience. She trusts him completely.
He is about to use that trust to build something that will last 350 years, reach across an ocean, and leave a mark on Spain that the country is still reckoning with today. His name is Torquemada, and the people he is coming for have nowhere to go. Tomás de Torquemada was not a cruel man by the standards of his time. This is the hardest sentence in this script to say, and it needs to be said first, because everything that follows only makes sense if you understand it. He was a Dominican friar, ascetic, disciplined, genuinely devout. He wore a hair shirt under his robes. He slept on a board. He refused to drink wine. He was Isabella's confessor for years before he became Grand Inquisitor, the priest she trusted above all others with the state of her soul.
When she needed someone to build and run the most powerful inquisitorial machinery in history, she chose him not because he was ruthless, but because she trusted him completely. He believed, with the full force of a disciplined medieval mind, that heresy was the worst thing that could happen to a person, worse than poverty, worse than illness, worse than death. A body could suffer and die, and the soul could still be saved. A soul corrupted by heresy was in danger of something permanent, eternal. In that framework, a framework shared by virtually every educated person in 15th century Europe, what Torquemada did was not cruelty, it was medicine, painful medicine, applied to prevent a worse disease. This does not make it acceptable. It makes it more dangerous. Because cruelty you can recognize and resist. Sincere conviction is harder to stop. The Spanish Inquisition was not the Church's instrument. This is the second thing that needs to be understood, because it changes everything about how the institution worked and why it was so difficult to stop. Ferdinand and Isabella requested it from Pope Sixtus IV in 1478. They asked for permission to establish an inquisition on Spanish soil under Spanish control. Sixtus IV agreed, and in doing so, made a decision he would spend the next several years regretting. The Spanish Inquisition was answerable to the Spanish crown, not to Rome. Its Grand Inquisitor was appointed by the monarchs. Its revenues went to the royal treasury.
When Sixtus IV, alarmed by reports of abuse coming out of Spain, tried to rein it in, tried to establish a right of appeal to Rome, tried to require that accused persons be informed of the charges against them and given time to prepare a defense, Ferdinand wrote back with essentially one message: mind your own business. Sixtus backed down. This is important, because the Spanish Inquisition is the institution most people picture when they hear the word, the auto da fe, the San Benito, Torquemada. And it was not a church institution running amok. It was a state institution, using the church's theology, the church's personnel, and the church's moral authority to serve the political goals of a monarchy. The goal, in 1478, was this: Spain had a converso problem.
Or rather, Spain had decided it had a converso problem. For generations, Jewish families across Spain had converted to Christianity. Some conversions were sincere, some were forced, the alternative being expulsion or death in the waves of anti-Jewish violence that had swept Spain in 1391 and after. Some were strategic. Conversion opened doors that were closed to Jews, in government, in trade, in the professions, in marriage into established families. By 1478, converso families had risen to significant positions across Spanish society. They were merchants, lawyers, bishops, physicians. Some had intermarried with the nobility. Some were 3 and 4 generations removed from any Jewish practice. And they were suspected. Not all of them, not even most of them.
But the suspicion was there. A whisper, a rumor. A neighbor who had noticed that the Converso family next door did not buy pork at the market, or lit candles on Friday evening, or observed a certain quiet on certain days of the year. The Spanish word for this was Judaizing, the secret continued practice of Jewish customs by people who had publicly embraced Christianity. Whether it was widespread is historically contested. Whether it mattered, whether a family that quietly observed Shabbat 2 generations after a forced conversion posed any genuine threat to Spanish Christianity, is a question the Inquisition never asked. It had already decided on the answer. Torquemada set to work. The machinery he built was efficient in the way that only bureaucracy powered by genuine belief can be.
Anyone could denounce anyone: a neighbor, a servant, a business rival, a former friend. Denunciations were accepted anonymously. The accused did not know who had reported them. They were brought before the tribunal and asked to confess, but they were not told what they were accused of, or by whom, or what specific acts had been observed. They were simply invited to examine their conscience and tell the truth. This was not an accident. It was a procedure. If you knew what you were accused of, you could construct a defense. If you did not know, if you sat across from a friar who looked at you steadily and waited, your own guilt, real or imagined, would surface. You would confess to something. You would name someone. The someone you named would be brought in.
They would confess to something. They would name someone. The system fed itself. Torture was available when confession was slow in coming. Pope Innocent IV had authorized it in 1252, formally, in writing, with rules. No bloodshed, could not be repeated. Confession under torture had to be confirmed the next day, freely, without duress, to be legally valid. These rules existed. They were also, in practice, regularly circumvented. Continuation of a previous torture session was not technically repetition. Legal fictions, again, the same ones all the way down.
The three standard methods were strappado, suspension from the wrists bound behind the back with sudden drops; toca, which involved pouring water over a cloth covering the face until the person felt they were drowning; and potro, in which cords were wound around the limbs and progressively tightened. These methods left no visible marks. They were, in the language of the manuals, moderate. They were, in the experience of the person in the chair, not moderate at all. Then came the auto de fe. The phrase means act of faith. It was not technically an execution. It was a ceremony. On the appointed day, usually a Sunday, usually a public holiday, to maximize attendance, the accused were brought out in procession through the city.
They wore the San Benito, a yellow robe, sometimes painted with flames, sometimes with the image of the person already burning in hell, and a tall comical hat called a carroza. They carried green candles. They walked through crowds of thousands. A mass was said. Sentences were read aloud. Most sentences were acts of reconciliation. The penitent confessed, recanted, was received back into the church with a penance. Fines, confiscation of property, imprisonment, the wearing of the San Benito in public for a fixed period. These were the common outcomes. The auto de fe was not primarily an execution ceremony. It was primarily a theater of power, a public demonstration that the Inquisition saw everything, knew everything, and could reach anyone.
Those condemned to death, the unrepentant, the relapsed, those who had confessed under torture and then recanted their confession, were handed to the secular arm at the end of the ceremony. The Church, maintaining its fiction, did not execute them. The civil authorities did. The repentant were strangled before being burned. The unrepentant were burned alive. This distinction mattered enormously to the theology. It matters very little to the people who burned. After the ceremony, the San Benito did not disappear. It was hung in the local church, the church where the convicted person had worshipped, with the family name written on it. It stayed there, for years, for decades.
In some churches, San Benitos from the first generation of the Spanish Inquisition were still hanging a century later, 2 centuries later. A family name on cloth, a permanent public record of what an ancestor had confessed to. Children grew up beneath their grandparents' San Benito. They could not enter certain professions. They could not marry into certain families. The concept of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, meant that converso descent, regardless of how many generations back, was a disqualification from positions of honor. You could be a Christian for 4 generations and still be barred from the priesthood because of what your great-grandmother had confessed in 1485. The Inquisition killed some people. It marked far more. And then it crossed an ocean.
The Portuguese Inquisition, authorized by Pope Paul III in 1536 for King João III, followed the Portuguese Empire into Asia. In 1560, the Inquisition established itself in Goa, on the western coast of India, the center of Portuguese colonial power in Asia. Its targets were not European heretics. They were Hindu converts to Christianity, people who had been baptized, sometimes under pressure, and who continued to blend Catholic practice with the Hindu customs they had grown up with, people who had never heard of the Cathars, people who had no connection to the theological disputes of medieval Europe, people who were guilty, in the language of the tribunal, of imperfect conversion. Voltaire, writing about the Goa Inquisition in the 18th century, called it the shame of humanity.
He was not wrong. The Goa Inquisition ran until 1812, 250 years, in a country that was not Europe, targeting people who were not the original targets, for crimes defined by an institution that had been built for an entirely different context 5,000 miles away. It is the least known of the 4 Inquisitions. It is not the least important. Back in Europe, the Roman Inquisition, founded in 1542 by Pope Paul III in response to the Protestant Reformation, was developing its own specialty. It was coming for the thinkers. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, was established in 1559. Copernicus, Erasmus, later Galileo, Kepler, Descartes.
The attempt to control what Europeans were allowed to read, to think, to build their understanding of the world upon, formalized in a list, maintained and updated from 1559 until 1966. 1966. The index was not abolished until the year the Beatles released Revolver. But the most vivid symbol of the Roman Inquisition is not a list. It is a man. February 17, 1600, Rome, Campo de' Fiori, the Field of Flowers. His name is Giordano Bruno. He is 49 years old. He is a Dominican friar, the same order that built the medieval Inquisition, the same order that produced Torquemada, the same order that produced Bernard Guy. He has been in the Roman Inquisition's prisons for 8 years. For 8 years they offered him the same thing. Recant. Say you were wrong.
Say the church is right and you are wrong, and you will live. He refused. Every time. His crimes were several. He had denied transubstantiation, the doctrine that the bread and wine of the Eucharist become the actual body and blood of Christ. He had denied the virgin birth. These were the theological charges that most directly threatened his life. But the ideas he had spent his life developing, the ideas that made him famous then and make him a symbol now, were cosmological. He believed the universe is infinite, that there is no center, that there are other suns beyond our sun, countless suns, each perhaps with worlds circling them, each perhaps inhabited. He had read Copernicus. He had gone further than Copernicus.
He had looked at the implications of a sun-centered solar system and followed them outward until he reached a universe without edges, without a fixed point, without the hierarchical structure that medieval cosmology and medieval theology required. He was right. Not about everything. His cosmology was not modern astronomy, but about the infinity of the universe, about other suns, about other worlds. He was right. He was looking at the sky in 1600 and seeing, with the instruments of pure philosophical reasoning, something that telescopes would not confirm for centuries. On February 17, 1600, he was led into Campo dei Fiori. The accounts say he was gagged so that he could not speak to the crowd.
One account says that when a crucifix was held out to him at the end, he turned his face away. He was burned alive. The Church has never formally apologized for Giordano Bruno. His statue stands in Campo dei Fiori today, bronze, life-sized, hooded, the way he was taken to his death, facing the Vatican, every single day. Now comes the part that is hardest to tell. Not because it is more violent than what came before, it is not. Not because it requires more research or more care, it does not. It is hardest to tell because it requires saying things that are true and uncomfortable in a different direction than the things we have been saying. Because honest history is not a prosecutor's brief. It is not a defense attorney's brief either.
It is an attempt to see clearly, and seeing clearly sometimes means saying things that complicate the picture you came in with. So, 3 things, all of them true, none of them a reason to minimize what you have just heard. The first is Galileo. Everyone knows the story. The Roman Inquisition hauls the greatest scientist of the age before its tribunal in 1633, forces him to kneel and recant the truth that the earth moves around the sun, crushes him under house arrest for the remaining 9 years of his life, and as he rises from his knees, having just denied what he knows to be true, he mutters under his breath, defiantly, irrepressibly, magnificently, and yet it moves. eppur si muove. It is a perfect story. It has everything. The lone genius against the institutional machine.
The truth that cannot ultimately be suppressed. The whispered defiance that carries across centuries. It is almost certainly not true. Not the trial happened. Not the recantation happened, on his knees, in full, documented and witnessed. Not the house arrest, that was real, and it was punishment, and it diminished the last years of a great mind. All of that is true. But, and yet it moves, the famous line, appears nowhere in any contemporary record. The earliest known source is a painting made more than 100 years after Galileo's death. Most historians consider it legend. The actual words Galileo spoke after signing his recantation are not recorded. What is recorded is the recantation itself, complete, unambiguous, and signed.
This matters not because it makes the Church's treatment of Galileo acceptable. It does not. It matters because the legend flattens a man who was genuinely complex into a symbol, and in doing so makes it easier to misunderstand what actually happened and why. Galileo was not a pure martyr of science against faith. He had friends in the Church. His work had been read and respected by Jesuit astronomers. He had dedicated an earlier book to Cardinal Barberini, who later became Pope Urban VIII, the pope who put him on trial. Urban had been for years one of Galileo's most powerful supporters. The falling out was partly theological. Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems presented the Copernican model so compellingly that the Ptolemaic model, the Church's preferred cosmology, was left in ruins. But it was also partly personal. Urban had provided Galileo with the argument he used for the book's supposedly neutral framing, that we cannot know with certainty how God arranged the cosmos, so both models should be considered. Galileo had given that argument to his Ptolemaic character. The character's name was Simplicio. Urban VIII did not find this amusing. The trial was theological. It was also political. It was also, in part, the consequence of a great man's inability to resist making a powerful friend look foolish. This does not excuse the Church. The Inquisition had no business trying a scientist for his cosmology. The house arrest was wrong. The forced recantation was wrong. The Church's formal apology, issued by Pope John Paul II in 1992, 359 years after the trial, was long overdue and genuinely meant. But Galileo was a human being caught in a human situation, not a symbol, not a myth, a man who made enemies, had allies, navigated power, and lost. The legend is tidier than the truth. The truth is more interesting. The second thing is the witch trials. When people think about the Inquisition and witchcraft, they picture the same thing, the same black robes, the same tribunals, the same machinery turned toward the accusation of women for consorting with the devil. The Inquisition and the witch trials blurring together in popular imagination into a single centuries-long persecution. The historical reality is more complicated, and in one specific case, it runs directly against the picture. 1609, the Basque region of northern Spain. A witch panic has taken hold. Accusations are spreading from village to village. People are denouncing their neighbors. Local secular courts have already executed several people. The fear is real. The social rupture is real. The accused are real people, mostly women, mostly poor, mostly without any effective means of defense. The Spanish Inquisition sends an investigator. His name is Alonso de Salazar Frias. He is a lawyer as much as a theologian, meticulous, methodical, trained in the examination of evidence. He travels through the Basque region for months. He interviews the accusers. He interviews the accused. He investigates the specific claims, the night flights, the Sabbaths, the transformations, the pacts with the devil, with the same systematic rigor the Inquisition applied to everything. He examines 1,802 cases. In not one of them does he find credible physical evidence that any of the alleged events actually occurred. Not one. He writes a report. It is careful, detailed, and devastating. There is no proof, he concludes, that any person in these 1,802 cases actually performed any act of witchcraft. The panic is real. The social damage is real. The beliefs are real.
But the crimes, the specific supernatural acts that people are being accused of committing, cannot be verified by any evidence he has been able to find. He recommends stopping the prosecutions entirely. The Supreme Council of the Spanish Inquisition reads his report. It accepts his findings. It issues new guidelines making witchcraft prosecutions nearly impossible, requiring physical evidence that no accusation can produce, because the acts being alleged did not physically occur. The Basque witch panic ends. Now consider what was happening elsewhere at the same time. In Germany, Protestant Germany, the witch trials of the late 16th and early 17th centuries killed between 30,000 and 60,000 people. Secular courts, Reformed Christian communities.
No Inquisition. The worst witch hunting in European history happened in places where the Inquisition had no jurisdiction. In Scotland, Protestant Scotland, King James VI personally supervised witch trials. Torture was used. People were burned. James was so fascinated by witchcraft that he wrote a book about it, Demonology, published in 1597, and later brought his enthusiasm for witch prosecution with him to England when he became King James I. The Spanish Inquisition, the institution most associated in popular imagination with witch burning, was by the early 17th century one of the more skeptical institutions in Europe on the question of whether witchcraft accusations deserved to be taken seriously.
Salazar Frias did not do this because he was a good man resisting a bad institution. He did it because he was a rigorous lawyer applying the Inquisition's own standards of evidence. The institution that had built the machinery of denunciation and torture also built, in Salazar Frias, a man who applied that machinery to its own procedures and found them wanting. This is not a defense of the Inquisition. It is a fact that does not fit the simple story, and complicated facts are the only honest kind. The third thing is the numbers. The Spanish Inquisition killed 30,000 people. That is the figure you may have encountered, or 100,000, or 300,000.
These numbers come from somewhere real, from Protestant pamphlets printed in the 16th and 17th centuries, from Enlightenment polemics by writers who had strong reasons to portray Catholic institutions in the worst possible light, from a long tradition of historiography in which Spain and the Church were cast as uniquely barbaric in a Europe that was, in reality, barbaric in many directions at once.
The modern scholarly consensus, developed by historians including Henry Kamen and Henry Charles Lee, neither of whom could be accused of sympathy for the Inquisition, estimates somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 executions over 350 years of the Spanish Inquisition's operation. 3,000 to 5,000. This is not a small number. Let me say that again clearly, because what comes next could be misread as minimization, and it is not. 3,000 to 5,000 people were killed, each one a person with a name, a family, a life, by an institution that believed it had the right to decide what they were allowed to think and what they were allowed to believe. That is real. That is inexcusable. That deserves to be named and remembered. And the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, a single episode of anti-Protestant violence in France in August of 1572, killed between 5,000 and 30,000 people in approximately 1 week, not 350 years, 1 week, by Catholics acting without any inquisitorial process, without tribunals, without the procedural machinery the Inquisition spent centuries developing, just mobs, just swords, just doors broken down in the night. The 30 Years' War, fought largely along religious lines in the same century, killed approximately 8 million people. The witch trials in Protestant Germany killed more people in a single generation than the Spanish Inquisition killed in 3.5 centuries. Accuracy is not apology.
Accuracy is the only way to understand what actually happened, and why it happened, and what kind of institution actually produced it, and what that tells us about institutions that claim the authority to police thought. The Spanish Inquisition was not the worst thing the 16th century produced. It was not even close. That does not make it acceptable. It makes it a warning, a specific, documented, bureaucratically precise warning about what happens when sincere belief is handed institutional power and told to use it without limit. Not a monster's warning, a professional's warning, the warning of a man who went home at night and got up in the morning and came back to his desk. We go back to Rome. The office, the cardinal, the file on the desk.
The Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, founded 1542 by Pope Paul III to combat the Protestant Reformation, to identify and suppress ideas that threatened the unity of the Church, to ensure that what Catholics believed, what they were allowed to believe, what they were allowed to teach, what they were allowed to write, remained within the boundaries the institution defined. It has never closed. In 1908, it was renamed the Holy Office. In 1965, under Pope Paul VI, it was renamed again, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. In 2022, it became the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. 3 names, 1 institution, 1 unbroken line from the man who authorized torture in 1542 to the cardinal reading a file in 2024. No one is burned anymore. No one is tortured.
No one is handed to the secular arm for execution. These things are gone, not because the institution chose to abandon them, but because the world around it changed enough that they became impossible. That is not the same thing as the institution deciding they were wrong. The theologians it has investigated in living memory are not farmers accused of lighting candles on Friday evening. They are scholars, careful, faithful, serious people who have spent their lives thinking about God, whose conclusions on questions of gender, sexuality, liberation theology, or the nature of papal authority have been flagged as inconsistent with official teaching. Hans Kung, stripped of his license to teach as a Catholic theologian in 1979. Leonardo Boff, silenced for a year in 1985.
Charles Curran, removed from his position at Catholic University of America in 1986. Gustavo Gutierrez, the father of liberation theology, investigated for decades before a partial rehabilitation late in his life. No bonfires, no sanbenitos, no strappado. Careers ended, books silenced, thinkers told that the ideas they had spent their lives developing were not permitted within the institution they had devoted their lives to serving. The office that began with ad abolendum in 1184 is still answering the same question it has always been answering. Who decides what is true? And what power should that right carry? So, here we are, 1834. The last formal auto de fe.
The Spanish Inquisition abolished, not by the Church, but by the liberal Spanish government that had finally, after decades of political struggle, accumulated enough power to do it. The Church did not initiate the abolition. The Church resisted it. And then, because the story does not end where most stories ended, 1826. The last person executed by the Inquisition was not a Cathar perfectus, not a converso in 15th century Seville, not a philosopher in Rome in 1600. He was a school teacher. His name was Cayetano Ripoll. He taught in a village school in Valencia, Spain. He had served in the Napoleonic Wars and come back changed, his faith altered by what he had seen and experienced, into something the Church considered insufficiently orthodox.
He taught his students, it was said, to open their prayers with "Praise be to God," rather than Ave Maria. He held deist beliefs, a conviction that God exists and can be known through reason and nature, without the mediation of church sacraments or authority. He was tried. He was convicted. He was hanged. The year was 1826. Not 1326, not 1526, not 1626, 1826. The United States Constitution had been in force for nearly 40 years. Napoleon had already risen and fallen. Beethoven was still alive, finishing his final string quartets. The steam engine was transforming the world, and in Valencia, Spain, a schoolteacher was killed for what he taught his students to think. Take a moment with that date, 1826. I want to give you 3 things to take with you, not verdicts.
History this long and this complicated does not fit into verdicts, but 3 things that are true, that I think matter, that I think deserve to be carried forward. The first is this: there was not one Inquisition, there were 4, and the differences between them matter. The medieval Inquisition built the machine. The Spanish Inquisition ran it at industrial scale for a monarchy, not a papacy. The Portuguese Inquisition carried it across an ocean into Asia. The Roman Inquisition turned it toward ideas and has never stopped. Each had different targets, different methods, different scales of violence. The total death toll, real, documented, inexcusable, was lower than myth claimed and higher than apologists admit.
The terror, the surveillance, the transgenerational shame, and the systematic suppression of thought extended far beyond whoever was killed. Numbers matter, and numbers are not the whole story. The second is this: every institution that claims the authority to define truth and punish deviation carries the seed of the Inquisition inside it. This is not a statement about the Catholic Church specifically. It is a statement about institutions, about the logic that begins with, "We know what is true," and ends with, "and therefore we have the right to enforce it." The Inquisition did not begin with cruelty. It began with a problem, real heresy, real social fracture, real theological dispute, and a sincere conviction that the institution had both the knowledge and the duty to solve it.
Bernard Gui went home at night. Torquemada wore a hair shirt. The inquisitors believed, and belief, handed institutional power and told to use it without limit, produced what you have seen in the last 30 minutes. The question is not whether this can happen again. It can. It has. It is not unique to the Catholic Church or to Christianity or to religion. Every system that concentrates the authority to define truth in a single institution and removes or weakens the structures that limit that authority is one sincere conviction away from a desk, a file, a question the accused does not know how to answer. The structures that limit that authority are not automatic. They do not maintain themselves.
They require the kind of people who ask, "Are we sure?" even when, especially when, asking costs something. Frederick II asked, Salazar Frias asked, Galileo, in his way, asked, and paid for it with 9 years of house arrest and a forced recantation that the legend replaced with a better line, because the truth was too complicated and too human to be satisfying. The question is whether we are building institutions that reward the asking or institutions that punish it. And the third. Cayetano Ripoll was hanged in 1826 for teaching his students to think. He was not a philosopher. He was not a scientist. He was not proposing a new cosmology or writing a theological treatise.
He was a school teacher in a village in Spain who had come back from a war changed, who had looked at what he had seen and arrived at a faith that the institution around him could not permit. He did not have a statue. He does not have a street named after him. He does not have a square in Valencia where bronze catches the afternoon light and faces the building that ended his life. He has a footnote. He has a date, 1826, that should be better known than it is. He has this. The Inquisition did not end because the Church decided it was wrong. It ended because the world changed around it, because Enlightenment governments, liberal constitutions, and the slow, painful expansion of the idea
that a person's inner life is not the business of the state, accumulated enough force to make the institution impossible to sustain. The Church did not lead that change. In most places, it resisted it, and the office founded in 1542 is still open, still reading files, still deciding which ideas are permitted and which are not, still answering, in its own way, in its own time, with its own diminished but not absent power, the same question it has been answering since a Dominican friar sat across a table from a farmer in southern France in the 13th century and opened his manual and picked up his pen.
Who decides what is true, and what power should that right carry? Those are not medieval questions. They are this morning's questions. And how we answer them, in our institutions, in our communities, in the structures we build and the ones we allow to persist, still matters more than most of us realize. Before I go, tell me in the comments, which part of this story landed hardest for you? Béziers, Bruno, the date 1826, the office that never closed? What stayed with you? I read every comment. I want to know. And if this gave you something to think about, share it. Not for the algorithm, because Cayetano Ripoll deserves more people knowing his name.